Hi, this is David Miller, and I'm here with the last in a series of mini-lectures on Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. Today we're going to conclude our discussion, which has been building through the last couple of mini-lectures, about the way Shakespeare represents women. And today we're going to talk about women as persons in Romeo and Juliet. Lord Capulet stands in his daughter's bedchamber praising the country estates owned by her rich suitor. But Juliet's body will not be added to the County Paris's demesnes. Instead, Capulet finds to his dismay that Juliet does not recognize his ownership of her and is not content to be exchanged like an orchard or a deer park. This is a significant contrast, especially since Mercutio is, let's face it, utterly sexist in his treatment of Rosalind. He jokes about her as if she were nothing more than a pretty face and a quivering thigh. But Rosalind isn't there, is she? Another of the play's nice ironies. Dramatically, she is only a name and nothing more, for she never appears on stage, never speaks a line. By not being there, Rosalind can perfectly embody the period's ideal of womanhood, summed up in the phrase chaste, silent, and obedient. But when women become characters on stage, they do something women were discouraged from doing in the world outside the theater. They speak. That's a simple thing, really, but its consequences are revolutionary. Why? Because the essence of drama is that it stages conflict, and the more deeply Shakespeare explores the nature of human conflict, the more fully he discovers that each person lives at the center of his own world of perceptions, feelings, and values. Chaucer knew this and created such characters in his poetry, but more than any writer who came before him, Shakespeare learned how to permit his characters, including the women, to speak for themselves, to speak from out of the center of their own world and their own being. My guess would be that Shakespeare did this as an artist and not for political reasons. We have no way of knowing what his social and political ideals may have been. What we do know, we know not because of any biographical evidence, because the evidence is in the plays themselves. We know that Shakespeare thought and felt and saw the world as a playwright and an actor. We know that he made remarkable discoveries about what his chosen literary form, the drama, could do. We know that he experimented with different forms and genres, with comedies and tragedies, histories and romances, and with radically different kinds of character, from the innocence of Juliet or Desdemona to the suffering of Shylock, the horrific yet strangely fascinating evil of Iago or Macbeth, and even the earthy literal-mindedness of Juliet's nurse, or the clown Launcelot Gobbo in The Merchant of Venice. What all these characters have in common is that Shakespeare lends each of them his own astonishing gifts of language, even as he makes each one sound just like himself or herself. Each of them sounds so convincingly like a person because his mind moves in its own distinctive orbit, circling around his desires, his particular experience of the world. Who but Juliet's nurse would describe an earthquake as a speech act? "Shake," quoth the dove-house. A perception that is utterly specific. The nurse remembers where she was and how she first noticed the trembling of the earth, but also utterly her own, for the nurse lives in a cartoon world where everything is a character, and even the dove-house gets to speak. So it's deeply embedded in the very nature of Shakespeare's drama that every character is a person, immersed in his or her own reality. And this means that whatever his opinions of women may have been after he knocked off work and went out for a pint of ale, while he was writing, Shakespeare knew that women are persons. Some of them don't put up much resistance to their official status as property. Lady Capulet tries to calm her husband, asking him first, "Are you mad?" and then telling him later, "You are too hot." But when he's done talking, so is she. "Talk not to me," she says when her daughter begs for mercy, "for I'll not speak a word." The nurse, less easily silenced, tries to stand up to the father. "You are to blame, my lord, to rate her so," and comes back at him twice more. "I speak no treason," she protests, And finally, may not one speak? Remember that dove house. Speaking matters a lot to the nurse. But Lord Capulet's answer is no. He, and he alone, speaks the Father's word, the Father's law, and that word cannot be contradicted. "I'll not be forsworn," is his exit line in the scene, and it means that having promised his daughter to Paris, he will not break his word. As far as he's concerned, that leaves no room for anyone else to talk. And even the nurse gives in, counseling Juliet to accept Paris. It's thoroughly pragmatic advice, but the nurse shows no comprehension at all of what it means to take a sacred vow. Juliet will not be forsworn either. "My husband is on earth," she says, "my faith in heaven. How shall that faith return again to earth unless that husband send it me from heaven by leaving earth?" In other words, her marriage vow was a sacred oath in the eyes of that Uberfather God, and as long as Romeo remains alive, she cannot marry anyone else without being disloyal, not just to Romeo, but also to the Uberfather in the sky. Out of loyalty to her husband and her deity, Juliet separates herself from the earthly patriarch, and in the process becomes more intensely a person than anyone else in the play. Her solitude is complete. "My dismal scene, I needs must act alone," she says. And she does act it alone in a soliloquy that gives full expression to the terrors she must face down so as to risk death in disobeying her father. She even fantasized dashing out her own brains with some great kinsman's bone, as if punishing herself, like Dobby, for her disloyalty to the lineage. But in her love for Romeo and her defiance of the earthly father, Juliet speaks of fears and desires her mother and the nurse could never imagine. In language so rich and vivid, it has never been forgotten. Out of this poetry, Juliet emerges as a character more powerful, a speaker more eloquent than her own father. In the end, her word wins out over his as she and her lover Romeo collaborate in their wooing to create a new way of speaking love. When the play forgets Rosalind, it forgets along with her all those Petrarchan cliches Romeo had been spouting in Act 1, and when it discovers Juliet, it discovers along with her a language of emotion that lives on after her death to become the paradigm of true love for a later age, when the meaning of marriage and family will have been transformed.